The bells rang out under a grey sky as the golden carriage glided through the mud and the silent crowd. Inside, sitting on cushions that looked more like silk traps, a girl of only 12 trembled, not from the cold, but from fear. Her dress embroidered with French lilies did not hide her pale face or her wide eyes peeking through the curtains. It was her wedding day. And while the crowd watched, fascinated and indifferent, Isabella of France was led to the altar not as a bride, but as an offering. At the ceremony, her childhood was buried alive under the veils of duty and diplomacy. Daughter of King Philip IV, the Fair, a monarch as feared as he was admired, Isabel grew up within the cold walls of power, educated among priests, embroidery, and political pacts. From an early age, she learned that her existence had a price and a destiny. For her, love was not a promise, but a bargaining chip. Her value was measured in treaties and alliances. And although she strove to be the perfect daughter, the virtuous and obedient princess, her heart carried something quieter and more dangerous: a deep thirst for recognition, affection, and control over her own destiny. When she was promised to Prince Edward of England, Isabel believed she could flourish in foreign lands, winning respect with her intelligence and beauty. In her eyes shone the hope of transforming her submission into influence, her sweetness into power. But this desire hid an invisible wound, a hunger for validation that would make her vulnerable to manipulation and contempt. Trusting that she could redeem her abandonment with obedience, Elizabeth unknowingly walked toward her own abyss. The English court, however, was not fertile ground for princess dreams. Received coldly, neglected by a husband more interested in his favorites than in his wife, she soon realized that her body had been given away, but her soul would never be accepted. Isolated, humiliated, and increasingly hardened, the sweet girl began to disappear under layers of mistrust and bitterness. What was innocence became strategy. What was love became a thirst for justice. And the girl who had been made a wife gradually began to transform into a dark mirror of the men who had used her. Isabel sought alliances, approached enemies, and fueled silent revolts. Behind the scenes, she plotted, not just to survive, but to avenge the child who had been sacrificed. The queen who once believed in the power of beauty and diplomacy now found herself surrounded by the corpses of her loved ones and emotional ruins, guided only by wounded pride. Her quest for dignity would lead her to cross dangerous boundaries, until she became, for many, the Wolf of France, feared, hated, and misunderstood. But behind the fierce name, the pain of a girl who was never heard still pulsed. In this story, we will dive into the trajectory of this child princess, who lived as a symbol of power, was silenced by pacts, and finally exploded in rebellion. A tragic tale of beauty and disfigurement, of loyalty and ruin. Get ready to learn not only the historical facts, but also the inner workings of a soul mutilated by the crown. And if stories like this touch something inside you, subscribe to the channel and share your feelings in the comments. Because the wounds of the past still whisper, and we need to listen to them. Time does not forgive what is shaped in childhood. And Isabel's body, still made of light bones and fragile dreams, was sculpted to obey. The girl heard the echo of orders as if they were prayers. Stand up straight, don't speak loudly, walk slowly, smile with your eyes. She was molded to please, but never to exist. Her silence was her virtue, and her virtue was her sentence. Under the stone arches of the French palace, a flower grew that would never choose where to take root. When the news of the marriage arrived, it did not come as an announcement, but as a hot iron seal on the skin of her soul. Edward of England would be her husband. Isabel had to leave. The clothes were chosen. The words rehearsed. Her body prepared as a reliquary of peace between two rival nations. But no one asked if there was a child inside. The princess was now just a symbol, a name engraved on parchment, a border tied with white veils and dried blood. On the crossing to England, the sea seemed more like an omen than a path. Isabel looked at the foam on the waves and felt something inside her breaking apart, like pages torn from a book before the story begins. The winds beat against the ship like invisible hands trying to hold it back. But destiny, once decreed, drags even those who cry silently. The English court received her as one receives a portrait. Beautiful, but voiceless. present, but untouched. Edward's eyes did not seek her out, and his touch was distant, like someone holding a glass for a toast, not for affection. Isabel learned early to smile at parties and bleed in silence. The gold on her head weighed more than her age could bear. Her body began to change. Not because of time, but because of loneliness. Her skin, once rosy, became pale. Her eyes were dry. And in the cold corridors of the foreign palace, she walked like a living statue, rigid, observed, soulless. Her every gesture was an attempt to prove her worth, to be noticed. But the emptiness around her was like glass, transparent and impenetrable. Eduardo preferred his favorites. Men who whispered secrets to him, who shared laughter, wine, and his bed. Isabel was an ornament who fulfilled a diplomatic role. A mandatory presence at banquets and a womb destined for the dynasty. Nothing more. No affection, no listening, no "are you alive?" The girl who dreamed of being loved now longed only to not disappear. Over the years, her pain became more acute. It was no longer the sadness of a rejected child, but the coldness of a woman who begins to harden inside. She learned to read eyes, interpret silences, manipulate the few threads of power she had left. The flower had become a thorn. And where once there was sweetness, now there was steel contained in satin. Still, the world demanded that she smile, that she bow, that she bear heirs with gratitude. With each birth, Isabel bled not only from her body, but from her withering soul. She was queen, but never mistress of herself. And deep in her chest, a cry grew. A cry that was not one of rebellion, but of a child who never stopped asking, "Why didn't anyone choose me?" Over time, Isabel's gentleness shattered like old glass. The woman who was born to seal agreements now walked like a shadow in the palace corridors, carrying in her eyes the memory of an aborted childhood. What remained of her innocence was corroded by indifferent glances and public humiliations. With every gesture neglected by Edward, a piece of her peeled away from her flesh and turned to stone. When her husband elevated Hugh Despencer to the position of supreme favorite, openly disregarding the queen, something broke for good. Isabel was cast aside, humiliated, silenced like a candle burned in the midst of a storm. Despencer didn't just ignore her, he hated her. And Edward, blind with passion, allowed it. The queen's presence became a veiled threat. It was as if her existence, once used as a bridge, was now an inconvenient obstacle. So Elizabeth left. Under the pretext of negotiating peace with France, she left the kingdom with her son, but she also took her thirst with her, no longer for affection, but for justice. In Paris, she rediscovered her origins, her lineage, and there she met Mortimer, an exile, a conspirator, a man wounded like her. And wounds, when they recognize each other, create pacts stronger than royal alliances. With Mortimer, Isabel did not find love. She found a mirror. Both had been swallowed up by the contempt of the establishment, and now they plotted not for personal revenge, but for a kind of spiritual adjustment with the world. She was no longer the sacrificed child. She was the she-wolf. The woman whose pain had overflowed the limits of submission and turned into a clenched fist. Together they crossed back over the channel with armies, with hatred, and with a new pact, to rewrite history by destroying what had destroyed them before. Edward was deposed, Despencer cruelly executed. The queen, once a wilted flower, now ruled like a storm. For a moment, the world saw in her something that confused and frightened them. A woman who rose from abandonment to occupy the throne with her own feet. But power does not heal wounds. It merely adorns them with a crown. And as the days passed, Isabel felt that the throne she had conquered was also made of nails. Her son, now king, looked at her with suspicion. The people who had applauded her began to whisper. Her victory tasted like bile. And her body, weary from battle, cried out for rest that her spirit could not give. The wolf, cornered, began to sense the end. And there was no glory in her chambers. Only the constant sound of memory, the wedding dress weighing on the shoulders of a girl who could never say no. The same girl who now, crowned, discovered that late freedom smells like rusty iron and loneliness. In the end, It was not the enemy who destroyed Isabel. It was the silence that came after victory. When all the cries ceased, and the bodies of her executioners rotted in the memory of the kingdom, she remained. But inside her, something was already saying goodbye. There was no more war to win, no offense to right. What remained was an open wound, not as acute pain, but as an absence of purpose. Her son, Edward III, raised amid echoes of betrayal and conspiracy, turned against her. Mortimer, the man who had helped her seize power, was arrested and executed. And Elizabeth was confined. Not in dungeons, but in palaces with locked windows and silent servants. It was the new form of erasure, confinement without shackles, penance without trial. There, in her chambers, the former queen paced in circles, like a tamed beast. The mirrors no longer recognized her. The letters she wrote were unanswered, and the gold that adorned her hair was now a bitter reminder of the girl sold as a promise of peace. Time, that cruel sculptor, no longer carved beauty, only ruin. Elizabeth began to dress in black, not in mourning for Mortimer, nor for Edward, but in mourning for herself. It was a ritual without an audience, a secret mass for her childhood, for her dreams, for all the yes she had said in the name of duty. Deep in her heart, the question still echoed. At what point did I stop being me and become just a symbol? Little by little, her body also began to decline. Her once steady hands trembled as she held the cups. Her skin, once golden, wrinkled with the speed of those who have lived too long inside themselves. Her body became a reliquary of memories, a sanctuary of everything that was left unsaid. The servants spoke little. The advisors even less. It was as if the queen had become a specter, a shadow creeping through the corridors she once ruled. But it wasn't madness that consumed Isabel. It was too much lucidity, seeing clearly in a world that prefers a veil, feeling everything when the rest no longer feel, knowing you're a piece on a board that never belonged to you, and yet, having left blood in every house you've ever lived in. Lucidity, sometimes, is the worst form of punishment. She wrote letters she never sent. She painted symbols on fabrics that only she understood. And in her eyes, now dull, there was something prophetic. As if she knew that her name would one day be remembered not for glory, but for tragedy. Not for power, but for what power tears from the soul before granting the throne. Isabel's last years were lived as if she were a widow of herself. The woman who walked through the gardens murmured wordless prayers, as if talking to the parts of herself that had been left in each room of the past. She was a presence that no longer disturbed, but also did not touch. Like an old painting covered in fine dust, still beautiful, but forgotten. She died at the age of 63. Her body, stiffened by time, was found surrounded by objects chosen with almost ritual precision. A silver crucifix, some dried flowers, and the habit of the Poor Clares, as if in her last days she wished to be a nun, or at least invisible. But the most symbolic thing was what she asked for in secret, to be buried with the heart of Edward II on her chest. There is no gesture that better sums up her story. The woman who was ignored, betrayed, violated by absences, yet still kept the heart of the man who neglected her. Not out of love, but because that heart, even deformed, was the only one that had ever belonged to her. A final act of power. A final reminder that, even in death, she carried within her the history of those who hurt her. Her tomb, discreet, rests in Greyfriars Abbey. There are no statues, no celebrations, just cold stone and silent ground. But there, beneath that surface, rests one of the most complex souls in medieval history. Not a saint, not a villain, but a child sacrificed to the throne, a wife used as a shield, and a woman who, in the end, tried to avenge herself as best she could. The world doesn't know what to do with women like Elizabeth. They do not fit into fairy tales or the male glories of war. They bleed in silence, conspire in the shadows, and die with too many truths in their hearts. But their names remain, like cracks in the stones that support the palaces, like ghosts that remind us that power, when imposed, always demands a body for sacrifice. Isabel's face does not appear in church-stained glass windows. But perhaps it is elsewhere, in the silent gaze of so many women who learn, from an early age, to remain silent in order to survive, who transform pain into intelligence, submission into strategy, beauty into armor, and who, even when defeated, are never completely vanquished. If this story touched you, if somewhere inside you there is a forgotten Isabel, a queen who was never crowned, a child who was never heard, leave your comment. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories like this. Because there are silences that need to be told. And there are truths that can only flourish in darkness. When a woman carries in her heart the heart of the one who denied her, the world does not know what to do with her. Isabella of France died with the heart of her executioner on her own body, as if sealing with her bones the story that no one dared to tell. Not out of love, but because she understood that some pains cannot be overcome. They are embraced, shrouded in silence, and carried like relics until the end. The exiled queen did not ask the heavens for justice. She asked that, at least in death, someone would see her wholeness. And what is left to the world when a woman like this leaves? Only the echo. The echo of her footsteps through cold corridors, of her whispers against humiliation, of her rejected and feared presence. The echo of the girl who, at 12, walked to the altar like a lamb, and left it like a specter. With every gesture of submission, Isabel planted a seed of rebellion. With every forced smile, a silent lament took root in her womb. She did not set fire to castles, but she burned inside. She did not scream in public squares, but she screamed in her deepest silences. The woman who had learned to be a symbol became a symbol of that which cannot be contained. She was called a wolf, a traitor, a scandal. But those who truly listened to her knew, inside her lived an ancient wound, the wound of all those who are sacrificed in the name of pacts they did not make. Imagine, now, an old, cracked mirror hanging in an empty room. In it, there is no clear image, only fragments. An eye, a lip, a piece of veil. Such is Isabel's memory, made of shards, of pieces that don't fit together, but which together tell a truth deeper than any perfect portrait. There is no way to reconstruct the entire face. But it is in this broken mirror that we recognize ourselves. And perhaps this is the final image of this story. A cracked mirror in a dark room, where light shines through the cracks and forms unpredictable patterns on the walls. Isabel was that, wounded light, but still light. And every woman who has ever remained silent in order to survive carries within herself a reflection of this shattered queen. She did not win as the books like to tell. She did not die to applause. Her name was not cleared in her honor. But she resisted. She survived what should have silenced her forever. And in this, there is a form of victory that the centuries cannot name. A victory that lives in the underground of history, between blood-stained veils and crowns that burn on heads. May this story remain alive not for the crown, nor for the throne, but for the girl. The one who was sold as a piece, used as a bridge, forgotten as a ruin. May she be remembered not as a victim, but as a warning. Because every system that sacrifices its daughters will one day be covered by the silence they leave behind when they depart. If this story touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel. Here we tell the stories that time has tried to bury. Leave your thoughts, your pain, or your silence in the comments, because there are ears that heal. And share this video with those who need to remember that there are still broken mirrors reflecting whole truths. Because some crowns don't shine, they weigh heavily. And only those who have bled under one understand what it means to live between the altar and the abyss. Eternal is the woman who was forgotten, but never defeated.